There's no doubt that health stories are dominating today's news agenda. We've got Dr. Ellie Cannon coming in a little later to cast a sort of overview, and in about 15 minutes' time, I'm going to be joined by DJ Mark Goodyear. He's going to be telling us about strokes. He himself suffered one a couple of years ago, and I'm delighted to see he's been making a good and excellent recovery. First, though, sticking with health, here's Kevin on the NHS contaminated blood scandal, and a little hope, or some hope, of some good news for victims.
Yes, I hope so. A public inquiry into, and I quote, the worst treatment scandal in the history of the NHS got underway today as victims of the blood contamination scandal received a rise in annual compensation from 46 to 75 million pounds. The long-awaited probe dates back to the 1970s and 80s when 4,800 people with haemophilia received transfusions infected with hepatitis and HIV, more than 2,000 of whom are thought to have died. Thousands more may have been exposed after surgery or childbirth. Presided over by retired Judge Sir Brian Langstaff and expected to last 2 years, the inquiry will hear evidence from 2,500 people who were treated with contaminated blood products. Victims and relatives want to know why warnings over the safety of blood-based medicines were ignored and why many documents and patient records seem to have been lost or destroyed. Joining us now, he's at the inquiry, is the co-founder of the health campaign group Tainted Blood, Andy Evans, who himself was infected with HIV when he was just 5 years old. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Kevin. Hi, Matthew.
Good afternoon to you, sir.
Andy, before we get on to this actual inquiry, you suffered at the hands of this blood contamination scandal when you were just 5 years old. It gave you HIV. Can you tell us how that has affected your life?
Yeah, I was infected, as you say, at age 5 in 1983 with both HIV and hepatitis C, and hepatitis B as well. My parents were told a few years later when I was about 10, and then they in turn told me when I was 12 or 13. And as you can imagine, you know, the vigour of youth, I felt invincible back then, and you know, brushed it off as something that, even though I knew obviously that AIDS had been portrayed as a death sentence, it was very much a case of, well, you know, I'll just have to become a researcher or a doctor and cure myself. Very, very conscious actually of the way that my parents were feeling, having to tell me this and having to carry that secret over the years, and almost trying to soften it for them, I think.
Can I ask, sorry, just from a point of complete ignorance, Andy?
Yeah.
Did the blood transfusion, anybody involved in blood transfusion, did they test blood for any kind of diseases or not in the 70s and 80s?
Well, yes, they did. And in fact, we've got documentation that proves that certainly as far back as the early 1970s, there was evidence of hepatitis within the blood. But one thing you need to know about haemophilia treatments is that it's different from blood supply, as in, you know, people receiving whole blood.
Right.
What happens when you're gathering blood products together is you take contributions of plasma from thousands of donors, pool them all together, and then you extract the relevant clotting factor, the protein from that. And if any one of those donors, any one of those 1,000 donors is contaminated or is infected with any of these diseases, the whole batch gets infected. I can't work out how the diseases got so far down the line that they weren't screened out earlier, and presumably that's at the heart of this. Yes, I mean, we know that back in the day, most of the plasma products, the haemophilia clotting products, came from the USA, and we know that it was from prisons and skid row donors, people who were paid and down on their luck for their blood
drug
products.
Addicts, perhaps.
Exactly, yeah, sex workers, people like that. And so we know that it came from those sorts of locations. It was fractionated and made into clotting factors in the United States. When the United States found out that it was causing diseases like hepatitis and HIV, in fact, these products were sold anonymised through Canada and then exported across the rest of the world, which is how they came to land in the UK.
Andy, what do you hope to gain from this inquiry? What kind of outcome from it would you like to see?
I and others have been campaigning for 30 years on this, and there's two scandals really in total here. There's the initial infection, which we believe could have wholesale been prevented. And then there's the way that the government has treated us for the last 30 years, offering us piecemeal financial support, and steadfastly refusing a public inquiry up until this point. And only now that they've been backed into a corner are they offering that public inquiry option.
So it's something of, one might argue, almost standard government practice, isn't it? Massive scandal happens. I'm thinking of Hillsboroughs or Bloody Sundays. People pay with their lives, innocent people pay with their lives, and then we wait 25 years plus for anything to happen. I mean, leaving aside how the blood came to be contaminated in the first place, which I'd like to return to, I mean, the delay, I mean, it must feel like insult compounding injury, does it not, to wait so long?
It certainly does. And you do start to question yourself, and you start to, but it always comes back to the evidence that we've gathered over the years, and you just know, I mean, the campaign group Tainted Blood, set up in 2006 on the back of many other campaign groups that have gone before us for the past 30 years, have gathered this evidence, and it's irrefutable in our minds that this happened. And to have it denied, and the platform to share it being denied for so long is, well, it's possibly a worse scandal than the original.
Andy, today Theresa May announced that this was a scandal that should never have happened. I think we can all agree that. But she also said that there will be a rise in annual compensation from 46 to 75 million pounds. Is that good news, or do you sense that is news management to try and gloss over the fact that this damaging inquiry in terms of the NHS and the government has started today?
It's a very coincidental announcement, don't you think?
Quite.
Yes, it certainly smacks of a last-minute ditch attempt. And to be honest, the details of it are so vague, I can't comment on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing yet. We don't know who the money is going to go to. We don't know how it's going to be distributed at this point. I think, the tactic of releasing it on the first day of the public hearings is scandalous, and I don't have words for them at the moment, to be honest.
Can I just go back to the contamination again? How could it have been eliminated? How could it have been avoided?
Well, I mean, as we know, there were warnings as far back as the 1950s that blood could carry pathogens. We knew that there was hepatitis in the blood from the 1970s. There were alternative treatments available for haemophiliacs. There was a treatment called cryoprecipitate. It wasn't 100% safe, but each treatment came from one donor. Right. And you can see how that might have been safer than pooling thousands of donors from across the pond. Even if they couldn't test for the pathogens at that point, they knew there was something there, and they knew that they ought to take care about it. And they didn't. They ignored those warnings, and they carried on as normal. And I think a lot of that is down to financial incentives provided by the big pharmaceutical companies in the US.
Okay, and what's your personal prognosis, Andy?
So I developed full-blown AIDS when I was 16. I was in and out of hospital for the next 4 years. The only treatment that was available was AZT, and I don't know if you've heard much about AZT, but it's an absolutely horrendous drug. It's like bulldozing your way through the immune system to try and knock out a small virus, and it takes everything along the way with it. I barely survived. My parents were given warnings on several occasions that I wouldn't survive the next infection. Somehow managed to battle through it, but of course, since then, it's been a case of trying to catch up on life, really, and try to make some sort of semblance of a normal life out of what remains. And I'm one of the fortunate ones, because I was infected with HIV. I was one of the 1,200 that were. There's only about 250 of us left alive today.
Do you have? I've got two questions I want to ask. Do you have a suspicion that that time is being used against you and other victims? Yes.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've always felt all the way along. If they wait long enough, there won't be anybody to complain about it anymore.
And I don't want to be rude or anything, but I'm assuming you've had some compensation, and I just want to know if it's gone any way to compensating you for what Kevin and I and the listeners will have just heard there, which sounds it's like something that cannot be compensated for with any amount of money.
That's is partially true. We've had ex gratia payments. It was never compensation because no liability has ever been admitted. So what's happened is that piecemeal over time, when the news story has popped up, the government will just add a little bit more support payment here and there.
As they did today.
As they did today, indeed, yes. Yeah, very coincidental. And that's what's happened for the past, since 1990, really, when the first payments came about. And it's just been, as I think Lord Owen put it quite well, that, when the news story crops up, they do as little as possible until it goes away, and then they'll do a little bit again when it reappears.
And as we're talking, I've just seen on, I think it's on Sky TV, on one of the graphics, it says that every 4 days someone dies from this scandal, and the inquiry is going to take 2 years. So maths isn't either my strong point or Kevin's, but I think we can work out that many more people are unfortunately going to have to pay for their lives before any form of justice is meted out. And Andy Evans, I admire your resilience and your calm, because I imagine deep down you are seething. Andy Evans there, co-founder and chair of Tainted Blood, who is, it's truly disgraceful, isn't it? The more you hear, it's a shocking story, shocking. It has so many echoes, I'm afraid to say, of other inquiries.
I didn't realise that no one has taken responsibility yet.